On November the 3rd, 2022, Tucker Carlson released his newest article, "Democracy is Not on the Ballot, Joe Biden." This graced the eyes of every Fox News subscriber across the USA. Unsurprisingly, this turned out to be Tucker Carlson trying to beat his previous record for most moronic political opinion in response to Joe Biden's speech made the night prior. To aid in proving his claims, Tucker Carlson recruited the help of media bias, specifically strawmanning, connotation, and black or white representation. With the first bias being as some background, strawmanning is the act of misrepresenting someone's argument in order to make it easier to attack their claims. In this scenario, Joe Biden is on the other side of Carlson's mental gymnastics. Tucker Carlson cobbles together clips taken from Joe Biden's speech on the upcoming midterm elections, as seen here.
There's something else at stake. Democracy itself. I'm not the only one who sees it. We must vote knowing what's at stake and not just the policy of the moment, but institutions that have held us together as we've sought a more perfect union are also at stake. We must vote knowing who we have been, what we're at risk of becoming. This is a struggle we're now in, a struggle for democracy, a struggle for decency and dignity, a struggle for prosperity and progress, a struggle for the very soul of America itself. Make no mistake, democracy is on the ballot for all of us.
In response, Tucker Carlson comes to this conclusion.
Democracy is on the ballot, says Joe Biden. No, Joe Biden, the names of candidates are on the ballot. Democracy is not on the ballot because democracy is not determined by the outcome of an election. Democracy is the election itself. Democracy is the process by which citizens choose how they will be governed according to their own desires. That's their choice. It's not yours. But Joe Biden is telling you the opposite, and you should know that. He's telling you that unless you arrive at a very specific outcome, the very outcome he commands you to arrive at, the system itself is illegitimate.
Essentially, Carlson is misrepresenting the entirety of Biden's speech by claiming that Joe Biden and the Democrats believe that if they don't win the midterm elections, then the outcome was rigged. In order to come to this conclusion, Carlson leaves out parts of the speech where Biden protests against the recent increase in political intimidation and election deniers. Here's a clip from Biden's speech.
My fellow Americans, we're facing a defining moment, an inflection point. We must, with one overwhelming, unified voice, speak as a country and say there's no place for voter intimidation or political violence in America, whether it's directed at Democrats or Republicans. No place, period. No place ever.
Carlson also forgets to include the part of Biden's speech where he talks about Nancy Pelosi, one of the most important people in the American government, who recently had her house broken into and husband attacked.
Good evening, everyone. Just a few days ago, a little before 2:30 a.m. in the morning, a man smashed the back windows and broke into the home of the Speaker of the House of Representatives, the third highest ranking official in America. He carried in his backpack zip ties, duct tape, rope, and a hammer. As he told the police, he had come looking for Nancy Pelosi, to take her hostage, to interrogate her, to threaten to break her kneecaps. But she wasn't there. Her husband, my friend Paul Pelosi, was home alone. The assailant tried to take Paul hostage. He woke him up. He wanted to tie him up. The assailant ended up using a hammer to smash Paul's skull.
The suspect, David DePape, as seen, is an election denier that attempted political intimidation. So it would seem that Tucker Carlson purposely left out this part of the article because it would undermine his entire point. But moving on, the theme of misrepresentation continues as Carlson misrepresents the entire Democratic Party in this next proof of bias. Connotation is the act of selectively choosing your choice of words depending on the emotional response they provoke. Tucker Carlson does this by calling the Democrats and their government Soviet. Yeah, throughout the entire article, Carlson just calls the Democrats was essentially a nicer version of commie bastard.
This is a dramatic misreading of what American democracy is. In American democracy, the people who control the system only have a right to control that system to the extent the public grants them that right through voting. What Biden is describing is the Soviet version of democracy, where elections exist to ratify the status quo, to bolster the cabal already in power. That's effectively what the Democratic Party is saying out loud now.
By definition, a Soviet democracy, or council democracy, is a democratic system in which the outcome of an election is decided by the already existing council, rather than the voters. I think many of us have come to the conclusion that Carlson's claims are illogical, but rather than make baseless claims by using the word Soviet, Carlson is using it strategically to influence the opinions of many American voters. You see, according to www.census.government, the majority of American voters are over the age of 40, putting their childhood right smack dab in the middle of the Cold War. Now, if there is anything I remember learning about the Cold War, other than the threat of total nuclear annihilation, it's the fact that the West really hated socialism, and its biggest supporter, the Soviet Union. Due to this, the majority of American voters grew up with anti-Soviet influence penetrating their skulls on a daily basis, leaving a sour taste for the word in their mouths. So, due to its bad connotation, by incorrectly calling the Democratic Party Soviets, Carlson is creating a false view of the party for the many American voters that grew up in between the 50s and 80s. On the other hand, Carlson also utilizes nationalism against the Democrats by referring to the current and desired form of democracy as an American democracy. Now, unless you've never heard of the USA before, I bet you can imagine this really gets some people going. With their pitchforks in hand, they grab their Bass Pro hat and secure it on their head. They get into their truck that has a metal ball sack hanging from its trailer hitch, and off they go to defend the Second Amendment and democracy to the very end. Anyways, it's time to move on to the next segment. Black or white is a form of rhetoric where two parties, possibilities, people, etc. are shown to be the only two components in a topic, while in reality there are more. In this case, Carlson continues his campaign by representing the two parties as the Soviet Democrats versus the citizens that wish to maintain true democracy. I've already shown you that Carlson believes, or at least wishes the public believes, that the Democratic Party and its supporters are Soviets, and that they wish to establish a council democracy. By doing so, Carlson is calling what is essentially half the American population Soviets. This ranges from the people of MAGA communists to conservative Democrats to the Democratic Socialists of America. Due to the way that two-party systems work, you can't realistically categorize this way. The Democratic Party consists of way too many factions to make a claim like this, especially when taking into consideration the policies of some factions like the Blue Dog Coalition. There's a great two-part video series by Monsieur and Carson that goes into greater description on the factions of American left. I suggest you watch it, and I'll link it in the video description. On the other side of the black or white, there are the people supportive of maintaining true democracy. Categorizing the people this way also doesn't make sense, as many of the people that wish to live under a true democracy are Democrats and their supporters themselves. However, Carlson is making it seem like this group is exclusive to Republicans and unaligned voters. What Carlson is trying to do here is convince you that these groups are mutually exclusive to each other. He's trying to force you into picking a side, and by the way he describes it, why would anyone vote Democratic if they're going to reform the democratic system? Sure, if you'd argue that some Democrats would support a council democracy so that only they could win, I'd agree with you. But it's dumb if you think the same couldn't be said about the Republicans. I think Biden said it best.
I've said before, you can't love your country only when you win.
Additionally, there were a bunch of smaller examples of media bias in the article that I would still like to make reference to. First up being guilt by association is a fallacy used commonly in propaganda, advertisement, and the news. It's when a group of people is attacked or defended on the assumption that they share something in common. This goes hand in hand with Carlson's use of connotation and black or white representation, as he associates the Democratic Party, along with their followers, to the Soviets, and by extension makes people feel guilty if they associate with them. Ad hominem is probably the funniest form of rhetoric, as it boils down to just making fun of your opponent to further your argument. There's a paragraph in the article where Carlson just straight up calls the Democrats sad and boring middle-aged people.
Because if the Democratic Party goes, so do they. The party is the only power they have. Once that party has been rejected, they will be nothing but what they already are. Sad middle-aged mediocrities with tragic personal lives and nothing interesting to say. So everything is on the line for them. They can't lose. And because they can't lose, they're now getting explicit about what if.
Like, come on, that's just hitting low-hanging fruit. Even I felt that one a bit. I think everyone can get behind populism. The idea of the little people rising up against those at the top of our society is always an appealing thought. On multiple occasions, Carlson refers to himself and America's voters in this way.
One final warning? One final warning? Really? Who do you think you're talking to, Ron Klain? Illiterate villagers? We're Americans. We are free people. You don't get to warn us of anything, much less for the last time. This is your final warning. Yeah, don't think so. You don't get to say that, Ron Klain. You don't get to say anything like that ever. Because this is a democracy, an American democracy, not a Soviet democracy. In our system, you don't get to issue orders to the rest of us on the eve of an election. No, you beg for our consent because our consent is the only legitimacy you have. This is our government. It's not yours. You are the servant. We are the boss. Act like it.
His idea of the voters being all-powerful against the government is a classic threat entwined with populist ideals. Carlson is doing this to get the public riled up and unite against the Democrats. This whole article was one big slippery slope rhetoric, that being an article where the author assumes that if scenario A occurs, scenario Z will as well. Tucker Carlson has based this article off of his belief that if the Democratic Party wins the midterm elections, then they will subsequently reform the current system of democracy into a council democracy. Now, I don't think I need to say that this is a pretty unlikely thing to happen, as changing government systems is a very complex process, on top of the fact that a civil war would wage. Well, I don't know about you, but to me this seems like Carlson is getting way ahead of himself. Media bias in the news is far from uncommon nowadays, with this video covering just a few possible forms of rhetoric and propaganda used to construct biased articles. Those being Carlson's strawmanning claims about council democracies, the use of Soviets' bad connotation, the far from reality black or white representation, and the smaller examples I mentioned. But that's really all there is to it. A big thanks to Tucker Carlson and his mildly infuriating but funny article. 10 out of 10, can't wait to forget it in a week.